Hello and welcome to an item tier list guide. In today's video I'm going to be going over the stats of items and showing you why certain items perform so well. I'm currently sitting at around top 5 O's at the moment. I've played over 100 games, so I have a pretty good grasp on the meta, and so hopefully this video will be helpful. Okay, so starting out at the top we have Spear of Shojin. So this is the primary mana gen item that you want on pretty much all of your AP carries. Even some AD item holders can hold it. And the reason that you want Shojin over blue buff is because there's so many better item holders of Shojin throughout the entire game. So the tempo that you get from Shojin is going to outweigh greeting a blue buff, and it's also just better item economy because you get to burn your sword. Of course, if you have a blue buff, it's better if you're playing towards Karma. However, Shojin just gives you so much tempo, and you want it on basically all your champions. As for Guinsoo's, this item is really good tempo, and it's best in slot on Kalista, which is the primary AD carry of this patch. And you can even utilize Guinsoo on some of the reroll comps. You can play around Tristana Cog reroll, as well as its best in slot on Syndra, so you never really feel bad about making it Guinsoo's. So the two main damage items that are the best tempo and the best late game, best in slot, it makes sense that they're at the top. And then third we have TG, so obviously TG is just a great slam because the glove items aren't actually very good this patch. You'll later see that some of the glove items just aren't very good, so putting them together to give you some extra damage for your team is just always going to be helpful. There's a lot of melee bruiser carries, such as Fiora. You can play towards Camille that just utilize TG really well. Ideally, you want it on a frontline unit that can utilize both tank, AD, and AP, but most of the time it's just guaranteed extra stats. The reason Gargoyles is so high is because of the new meta playing around Wukong. So Wukong is a really busted unit right now. He's very overtuned and I'm expecting nerfs, and you can actually stack Gargoyles. So if you go double Gargoyles on a Wukong 2-star, he's basically a 5 cost. He just tanks a ridiculous amount of damage, and the current meta right now is playing around Syndra. Even a 2-star Syndra and Wukong 2-star is stable enough to get you a top 4. This combo is really broken, and then even if you don't go for Wukong 3, you can just move those Gargoyles over to any of the other frontline units. Nash is up there because it's basically like a mini Guinsoo's. Most of the AP champions that want attack speed, such as Syndra and Karma, can utilize the Nashes quite well. There's nothing wrong with it, it's just slightly worse than Guinsoo's in a lot of cases, but in a lot of the AP lines, for example Karma, Veigar, they utilize the Nashes a little bit better than Guinsoo's because the fights are a little bit faster and they're not ramping up as much, so nothing wrong with the Nashes. And then Declaw is just a slightly worse Gargoyles because we're in such a heavy AP meta, and you'll notice that Bramble is definitely a lot lower in the list because it doesn't really shut down any of those AD lines as they have so much AoE anyway. So building a Gargoyles or a Declaw is going to be a must on your front line. And then finally in S tier we have Bloodthirster. So I already talked about how a lot of comps want to utilize the TG onto the Camille or Fiora. If you don't happen to have a TG for them, then you want to synergize BT with some other bruiser items. Okay, so moving on to A tier, we have Warmogs and Redemption, just generic good frontline items. Morello is the primary anti-heal because it lasts longer than Red Buff, and you don't really want Sunfire this patch because if you put Sunfire on a frontline unit, they're usually just going to die, and you're also not hitting the backline, whereas there's a lot of backline access this set, so you'd rather just have Morello. For example, Karma holds it really well, and Karma can actually hit backline, as well as you can put it on champions like Ryze, and it's just going to be your best form of anti-heal. Helm is basically a worse version of Shojin. It's slightly higher in the stats than Blue Buff just because it's so versatile. You can utilize it as a frontline item in the early game, and then if you don't happen to get Shojin later, you can just put it on your units like Karma. You can even stack Blue Buff and Helm as well, so Helm's just very flexible. Steadfast Heart is one of the weaker tank items. It's generically fine, like it's good on absolutely everyone, except for the fact that it's just not as good as the other tank items, so you only really make this to burn gloves, which is really good for your item economy. JT is pretty good this set because the main AP carries are Karma and Syndra, who stack up a lot of AP, and then the main AP carries not actually Nami but Veigar reroll is really good, and he stacks up AP from his charms. And because you don't need a raw AP on a lot of the meta AP carries, JG is just a fine damage multiplier. We have Red Buff here, slightly worse than Morello. They're very similar items. Red Buff, it can be better on certain champions for the attack speed, notably like Syndra. However, because the anti-heal doesn't last as long, if you're playing units like Karma, you usually prefer the Morello. Spark is a very good form of Shred. However, similar to Sunfire Cape, the reason that it's only in A tier is because when the frontline unit dies with it, then obviously you're not going to be getting that Shred. Also, with a lot of backline access this set, the Shred's not going to be able to reach the whole board. Generically, fine slam, however, sometimes you might want to prioritize the Shiv, and in a lot of cases you can kind of just ignore the MR Shred because you're going to have backline access anyway. And finally in A tier we have Giant Slayer. This is just a fine damage multiplier item. You never really want this as your first item, however there's nothing wrong with having a GS towards the late game. In B tier, we have blue buff. As I already mentioned before, Shojin is just better tempo, so you want blue buff on your Karma, but for everyone else, you pretty much just want to go with Shojin. However, if you are playing around Pandora's or you happen to get an early Karma, then going for an early blue buff is fine. Crown Guard, generic frontline item that is good, however, it does burn a rod, so sometimes you don't really want to go for it and would rather just go for Gargoyles, which leaves the rod open, so you can actually go for damage items. Death Cap is just a slightly worse JG on a lot of champions because they have so much AP anyway. I imagine once Rise becomes a bit more meta as well as Nami, then the Rabadons will move up a little bit. Asterix is fine when you're playing around some of the warrior rerolls as well as going fast 8 and playing around Fiora. However, because the item is only used on certain champions and Olaf isn't very meta this patch, it's just stuck in B tier because it doesn't have enough item holders. Shiv, very similar to Spark, however it does burn the tier. That's the main reason that Shiv is so low in the stats, in my opinion, is because you don't necessarily need the shred, and losing out on a bow and a tier when you really want Guinsoo's, Shojin, Rageblade, those kind of items is really bad for your item economy. Hand of Justice is just a worse BT, which is why it's so far down in the stats. The extra shield from BT is a lot more beneficial than any of the bonus stats from Hodge. Archangels is just a slightly worse Rabadon, it's pretty much the same item though. Bramble Vest is a much worse Declaw just because of the current state of the meta. The main AD champions that would get stuck on the Bramble Vest just don't exist. Bramble Vest will do a very good job at shutting down Olaf, but because Olaf's not very meta right now, that's not really a problem. Versus the other AD champions such as Fiora or Callista, they have AoE and means of getting around the Bramble. For example, Callista can just ramp up and just throw spears at the backline, and then Fiora can just dash away anyway, which is why Bramble's so low. I already mentioned before why Spark was bad and Sunfire is bad for a similar reason. You want the anti-heal onto the backline, not the front line in a lot of cases. Edge of Night is a really good item actually. It's great later into the game, very similar to GS. However, it's relatively low on the stats because you don't really want to be making this early as it doesn't do anything for your board until maybe about stage 5. The glove items are just really bad this set. This is because if you have Last Whisper IE, you want to be playing around Varus, who just isn't very good this patch, and Callista would much rather have raw attack speed. You'll often see double Rageblade Callista, as well as the Fairy on her, so Last Whisper and IE, there's just not many holders of it, which is why it's so low in the stats. Vow is a very generic and decent frontline item, however because it burns a tier, it's really bad for your item economy, which is why it's so low. Titans is fine this set, you can play around Titan's Fiora, it's pretty good on the multicaster reroll options, you can put it on your Akali or your Kassadin, however there's just slightly better options for it, and anyone other than multi-strikers, it just takes a while to stack up, which is why it's so low. And down at the bottom B tier, there is Gunblade as well as Guardbreaker. These are both generic, fine third items. However, if you're looking for true best in slot, it's never going to be Gunblade or Guardbreaker, which is why they're just the bottom of B tier. And then finally, in C tier, we have Quicksilver, Even Shroud, Deathblade, and Runins. So with Quicksilver, it's only really good on Kassadin, just because he's constantly auto-attacking and you want to make sure that he's just never has any downtime. But other than Kassadin, there's not really any other QSS holders. And with Even Shroud, because you have backline access, you don't really need to be shredding the armor, and it's not a very good AD meta. Maybe when Olaf or Varus is back in flavor, then Even Shroud will go up a little bit, but for right now, it's pretty bad. Deathblade is surprisingly good in the stats on certain champions like Fiora and Akali, just because you want them one-shotting the backline. However, generically, it's not a very good slam, just because if you are playing around AD Flex and you have to go around either Varus or Callista, you'd rather lean towards Callista, and again, she wants attack speed. And Runin's generic, fine last item, however, you don't really want to be slamming this because the bow would rather be a Guinsoo's, and of course the cloak is just going to be a generic good frontline item. And that is it for today's video. I hope you guys did enjoy getting a bit of insight as to why you should be making the S tier items and staying away from some of the lower tier items. Excuse my voice, I got my wisdom teeth out, so it's a little bit hard to move my jaw, but hopefully that will be recovered in the next couple of days. That's all from me for today, guys. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.